Yes.
Okay, so from vision to master file. Let's move this out of the way. So earlier this year in mid-May, we went to Hawaii. But before I went, I got wind that there was going to be a total lunar eclipse on May 26th. And I was still going to be in Hawaii at that point. So since I had never photographed a lunar eclipse, I decided this would be a great opportunity because Hawaii was right here, right smack in the middle of where you get to see the entire eclipse. So that's what I planned to do. And this is what I had as a vision for the kind of picture I wanted to take. There's this photographer, Michael Fry, who I get email blasts from occasionally. And every time there's a lunar eclipse, he'll send out an email telling people about it and telling you how to go about taking pictures. And he also includes some of his pictures. And so this is what I had in mind, some foreground, nice foreground with the whole line of moons as it progressed from before the eclipse, through the eclipse to after the eclipse. So that is the vision of what kind of image I wanted to create. So in order to do this, that kind of image, a lot of planning is involved. And what I did was, for this kind of planning, is use the PhotoPills app that you can get for your Android or Apple phone. And this gives you a whole bunch of information on the eclipse. So you can see in these two screen captures from my phone, if you set the app to the correct date for the eclipse and set it to the right time and turn on that it should give you information about an eclipse, it will show you that the eclipse begins at 10:48 and progresses through to full totality at 1:19 a.m. and then continues on until it's completely done at 3:50 in the morning. So that tells you when and what the different positions of the eclipse will be. And so I needed to do some planning before I left for Hawaii because I wanted to know what lens I was going to need in order to capture this full expanse of the eclipse from before through the eclipse to afterwards. And so if you go into PhotoPills and set the time to when the beginning of the eclipse is 10:48 down here, it shows you with a line where the moon, what orientation the moon is going to be. Here it is in the south-southwest part of the sky. And if you take this top section of PhotoPills and scroll it to the left, you can see what the elevation of the moon will be at that point. And as you change the time, you can see this line pointing to the moon rotate clockwise. And when it's in the most southerly position, that's when the moon is at its maximum elevation, which I made note of, and that was at 47.4 degrees. And then as it continues on to the right, you'll get it in this position at 3:50 in the morning, which is the total complete end of the eclipse. And this is now in the east-southeast direction, and you can look that up in the PhotoPills, and it tells you that's at 231 degrees, and the earlier south-southwest was at 149 degrees. So that span, that angular span that you need to cover with your lens is 82 degrees. And horizontally, and vertically, it's going to be 47 degrees up above the horizon, but you probably want to include something below the horizon, some foreground. So let's round that off to 50 or 52 degrees. So I needed a lens that could encompass a field of view that was at least 82 degrees wide and 52 degrees tall. Well, PhotoPills has a little pill, they call it, a section, where it will tell you for your camera and lens what the field of view is. And so I looked up in there, and for my wide angle zoom lens that I typically use for landscapes, a 17 to 40 zoom lens, at 17 millimeters, The angle of view horizontally is 93 degrees, and it's 62 degrees vertically. So that told me that lens was wide enough. And so I could use that lens, and I didn't have to resort to taking my 14 millimeter lens, which is a harder lens to use because it doesn't have autofocus, doesn't have auto exposure, any of that. So that was great. I knew which lens to pack, and off we went to Hawaii. And when I was there, then I needed to do some planning on where it was I was going to take this picture. And to keep things simple, I decided that it would be best to choose a place that was within walking distance of where I was staying. We were staying in the southwest side of Oahu in a resort area called Ko'olina. And they have there in Ko'olina 4 man-made lagoons that are really nice, picturesque beaches. And so I figured one of those lagoons would probably work out well. So I went walking all along the pathway that goes from one lagoon to the next, and took my PhotoPills app in my phone, held it up using its what's called a virtual reality mode, which shows you through the lens in your phone, the camera in your phone, what you're looking at. And on top of that, it overlays where the moon is going to be, and I could set the time for during this eclipse. So I could see the moon would start over here on the left, progress to the right, and doing that, I was able to find a good location. As it turned out, lagoon number 3 was the one that was oriented in the best location for giving me a decent composition with the moons across the sky and something else in the foreground. And so I chose a location based on the scouting. And then what I actually found out, the most accurate way to figure out where to be was to use these maps in the PhotoPills, because it shows you precisely where the moon is going to be when I wanted to start taking pictures, precisely where it was going to be when I stopped taking pictures. And this was a little more accurate than using the virtual reality function in PhotoPills. Okay, so that got me a location, but now I needed to plan out how I was going to do the shooting. What kind of exposures did I need to use? How often was I going to take pictures of the moon? Well, Michael Fry comes to the rescue with that. In those email blasts that he sends out, in addition to showing you a picture of what he's done in the past with these lunar eclipses, he gives you the exposures that he used. And so you can see here a list of the various different exposures that you need to make at various stages of the eclipse. From the beginning, when it's when it's basically a full moon and you have an exposure designed for a full moon, all the way progressing to when it's fully eclipsed and the moon's quite dark, you need a much longer exposure to take a picture. In addition to that, there is, though, one constraint. The moon is moving, and so you can't take arbitrarily long exposures of it. You need to have short enough exposures that it isn't blurred. And the rule that he gives is a 200 rule, namely, take your focal length, divide it into 200, and that results in the number of seconds you can use for an exposure that won't be blurred. So for example, for my 17 millimeter lens, that told me that 11 seconds was the maximum I wanted to take. Now, the other thing he does with these exposure recommendations is he gave them all for a particular f-stop, f11, with the idea being you'll probably want to do something like focus at a hyperfocal distance at a smallish aperture like f11. That'll get you an in-focus foreground. And then even out at infinity where the moon is, that'll be acceptably sharp as well. And so he gave you those settings, but you don't have to stick with these settings. You can use any equivalent exposure settings and those would be fine. As far as how often to take pictures of the moon, for his pictures that I showed you earlier, he takes pictures of the moon every 10 minutes, but you could space the moons out a little farther and use, say, 15 minutes or even 20-minute intervals between exposures. I decided that his were pretty good, but I wanted it just a little bit farther apart. So I chose, sort of sight unseen, 12 minutes as the interval that I was going to use. In addition to the exposures for the moon, you also need a foreground exposure. And that was actually going to be quite easy, because before the eclipse starts, the moon is full and it's shining on your foreground and providing lots of light. So all you have to do is get there a little bit early, take a picture before the moon will be within your frame, and you'll get a nice picture of the foreground that you can use. Furthermore, you may have noticed in his pictures that the sky was quite dark and there were actually stars in the sky. And the way you get that kind of picture is when the moon is at totality, it's actually quite dark enough that you can see the stars in the sky. So you just have to take some extra pictures at that point with an exposure designed to take pictures of the stars. And then you'll have that you can blend in and use as your background for the moons. So given that there was going to be a whole series of pictures that I was going to have to take with exposures that were varying all through the night, I didn't want to leave this up to chance and me referring to just a short list of suggested exposures. So what I did is I took a piece of paper and wrote out all the times that I wanted to take pictures, starting at the middle when there would be full totality, and working back in 12-minute intervals and working forward in 12-minute intervals. And I just estimated what part of the eclipse the moon was going to be in at that particular time, and wrote down the suggested exposure based on what he had told me. So I had a nice big list of exposures to make things a little bit simpler on myself. Okay, so that was the shooting planning. What about actually carrying out the shooting? Mm-hmm. So I guess what you could do is you could sit there and watch your watch, and every 12 minutes, snap a picture on your camera. But that's just another source for errors to occur, and I didn't want to leave, this chance that I wouldn't get again very soon, just up to that kind of accidental, I could miss an exposure doing it that way. So I chose to use an intervalometer, which you can program to say, take a picture every 12 minutes and just let it do the work for you. But since these exposures were the exposure settings were kind of a suggested value, I didn't know that they would be exactly right. And so in addition to taking the suggested exposure, what I wanted to do was bracket the exposures. Take one stop darker, take another, one stop brighter, in addition to the suggested one. So I'd have 3 exposures to choose from, and hopefully one of those would be correct. And as it turns out, with this intervalometer that I have, I could actually program it to do those brackets in addition to, and set them up to occur every 12 minutes. And the way you do that is the intervalometer has basically 2 timing settings that it can use. You can use an inner setting or an inner loop where it takes pictures in short succession, which are the brackets. And then you have an outer loop, which you can say, take those brackets every 12 minutes apart. And that was kind of interesting because I noted that this intervalometer had this capability when I first got it, because it was something different that previous intervalometers I had seen did not have that capability. And I was kind of wondering, where would you ever use that capability? And this turned out to be the case where I could do it. And how I did it was I set the camera into its auto bracketing mode so that when you pressed the shutter, it would take the first exposure, you press the shutter again, it would take the minus exposure, press the shutter again, it would take the plus exposure. So it would do 3 different exposures with 3 successive shutter presses. In addition, to prevent the shutter from shaking my camera, I put it into mirror lockup mode, and I used a 2-press mirror lockup mode. Namely, the first press locks up the mirror. You wait a few seconds for vibrations to die down, and a second press of the shutter then takes the picture. And then you start it all over. Well, between the bracketing and the mirror lockup, that meant that I had 6 exposures to take on the inner loop of this intervalometer, and then the outer loop would be every 12 minutes. So I set up for 6 20-second exposures. And why 20 seconds? Well, I had to set this up to account for the longest exposure that would ever occur during the night. And the longest exposure was during totality of the eclipse. That was nominally an 8-second exposure, but since I was bracketing, I would end up with, in addition, a 4-second exposure and a 16-second exposure. And so rounding 16 up, I just chose 20 seconds as the amount of time I would allow the intervalometer to use. Those of you who are paying attention may notice that my 16-second exposure is longer than the maximum exposure I should take for a sharp moon, which was 11 seconds. That was an oversight on my part. In the excitement of planning for all this, I sort of forgot about that when I planned this out. So next time I'll have to make sure I don't do that. But it didn't cause any real grief in this case. The moon was sharp enough. Okay. The only complicated aspect in programming the intervalometer was the fact that for the outer loop, if you want it 12 minutes apart, you don't just say, put it 12 minutes apart. You have to tell it what the gap is between the ending of the inner loop and the beginning of the next occurrence in the outer loop. And so I had to just do a calculation of that. 12 minutes is 720 seconds. I had 6 20-second exposures. Between each of those exposures on the inner loop, there has to be a minimal delay between them. The minimum delay is 1 second. So there were 5 delays between those. So that gave a gap of 595 seconds. This I had to, verify by experimenting with the intervalometer beforehand, just to make sure that it all worked out right. Doing that, I discovered that there was not a 1 second delay at the end of each of the 6 20-second exposures, only between them. So only 5 total delays. But that got me the intervalometer programmed. And then I'll point out that to run the program in the intervalometer, you press this play stop button. You don't press the shutter button. But that gives you the advantage of leaving open the shutter button so that if you need to take other pictures during the time that this whole programming is occurring. So for example, during totality, you take the 6 exposures, the 3 bracketed exposures during totality. And once that's done, you're waiting almost 10 minutes until the next set of exposures. It's during that time that I take the star pictures using a different exposure to get pinpoint stars. And so I did those pictures by just changing the exposure settings on the camera and pressing the shutter button to get the exposure. Okay, so I was all set, had my intervalometer programmed, went out there, set up in the location that I'd figured out from my scouting and photo pills. And of course, there were problems. The first problem is there were clouds that evening. The weather forecast, however, said the clouds were going to go away and they shouldn't really impact the eclipse too much. Well, they were there at the beginning, but they did eventually go away. So it caused me some grief at the beginning where I would see the intervalometer start taking pictures, but I looked up at the sky and the moon was behind clouds. And so I just had to let that happen, but the clouds were moving and there were breaks in the clouds. So if there was a break in the cloud and I had missed some previous exposures of the moon, I could just use the shutter button to retake those pictures, pressing the shutter button 6 times to get all the 3 bracketed mirror locked up pictures taken. The second problem was in interpreting Michael Fry's description of when you should do an exposure setting to pace depending on how eclipsed the moon was. And the photopill's explanation of, what stage of the eclipse things are in. So for example, at 10:48, we see that this is where the eclipse is supposed to just start. But if you look at a picture of what's going on, there's actually two shadows of the Earth that the eclipse goes through. There's this partial shadow called the penumbra, and then there's this full shadow called the umbra. I had sort of interpreted that when the moon went into the penumbra, that's when I was going to start to see an eclipse occurring. But as it turned out, even after 10:48 and up to 11:45, while the moon was in this penumbra, I couldn't tell a difference between the moon being in the penumbra and the moon being outside of the penumbra, just being a normal full moon. I didn't see any eclipse going on there. So what that meant was my carefully written out schedule of exposures was wrong, and I really needed to start the eclipse exposures an hour later than when I thought I had to. So I had to do some scrambling, but I figured it out, and I was able to adjust for that. Okay, now the third problem was when I'd gone out and done this scouting, there's this pathway that you walk along near the lagoons. Next to the pathway is a big expanse of lawn, and beyond the lawn comes the beach. And from a compositional point of view, it would have been really great to position my camera on the lawn, because I would have been a little bit farther back and able to get a little more of the sand into the bottom of the composition. However, knowing that it was lawn, I figured it was likely that they were going to water the lawn in the middle of the night. And sure enough, they did. But I was on the beach, so, knowing or expecting that the sprinklers would come on. But I wasn't quite far enough away from the lawn. I hadn't really quite anticipated how much overspray of their sprinklers there would be. It didn't go onto my camera, but it did get me a little bit, and it got my camera bag a little bit, so I had to scramble and move things around a little bit. But fortunately, the camera was okay. The final problem, one I didn't anticipate, is there were ants in the sand. So that just made things a little uncomfortable. Okay, but I went through the whole shooting. I had started early before 10:48 so I could get my foreground shot with the full moon. Shot through the whole night, got till, like 4 in the morning, and all the shots were completed, stopped the intervalometer, packed things up, and headed back home where I could finally go to sleep. So that left me with, in the next couple days, taking these images, loading them into Lightroom, and trying to create or assemble a proof of concept to decide, did I really succeed at taking this picture or not? And so what I did was the pictures were loaded into Lightroom. So I scanned through all these moon pictures. I had 3 brackets of each moon. And I chose one of the brackets that I thought was the best exposure, marked that with a star so I could find it easily again. And then I had my foreground picture, and that was going to be the base picture that I basically put at the bottom of a stack of a bunch of layers in Photoshop that'll be the foreground, and I'll put these moons on top of it. The foreground image was nice. The exposure was good. It was lit by the moon. It was just, standard type exposure, nothing fancy. I had plenty of time to judge that while I was taking the picture. But because I wanted to get in, all of the moons, and they were up at, 45 degrees above the horizon, I had to angle my camera back quite a ways to get the moons in the composition, in addition to the beach at the bottom. And as a result, the buildings and palm trees that were at the side of the composition end up very skewed and looking like they're tipping over. And that looks really bad. But you can fix that in Lightroom. There are geometric corrections which allow you to straighten out sloping buildings. So I use the geometric corrections. The downside to them is they warp your image. And as it turns out in this case, it takes the bottom and shrinks the whole bottom of the image so that the lower left and lower right corners of my beach got cut off. Not all of the beach got cut off, so the easy route to fixing that was just crop off the bottom where these holes were from the geometric corrections. And it gave me a beach, but not as much beach as I really hoped for. The final thing I needed to do was then add in layers for each of the moon pictures. And what you do is you set the blending mode of each of those moon pictures change it from normal to what's called a lighten blend mode. And what lighten says is in this layer that you've just added, any pixel that is brighter than whatever it sees in the layers below it, it will let shine through. And any pixels that are darker, it'll just let the lower layers shine through. Well, that's perfect for doing moon pictures like this because each of those moon pictures is basically a bright white moon on a black background, black sky. And so the sky just goes away and lets whatever sky you had from the foreground image shine through. And the moon then shines through directly on top of the sky from that foreground image, which was kind of blue, and you get to see the moons. Since each of these moons was a different exposure and the exposures were changing through the night, they all weren't exactly the same. And so I found out I had to add some brightness contrast adjustment layers to some of the moons to even out the exposures to make them all look, reasonably like they're the same exposure. But it all worked, and it gave me a proof of concept image that looked like this. So basically, something sort of similar to what I got from Michael Fry, but not quite the full vision of what I had in mind. And here's how it differs from really what I had in mind. You'll notice that some of these moons were obscured by the clouds, and that doesn't look great. In addition, if you look at moons that are particularly towards the edge of the frame, up here and over there, and it even continues sort of all the way through, due to wide angle lens distortion, those moons are looking oblong. They're not circular. And that's really crummy looking. If you look at Michael Fry's moons, his moons are all nice and circular. Okay, so there must be a way to fix this. Okay, in addition, the moons are kind of small in my picture. That was to be expected because I am using a wide angle lens. And so with a wide angle lens, something as far away as the moon is going to be small. But to make a more impactful image, it would be nicer if these moons were larger. And so, I was looking for a way that I could make these moons larger. Another thing, if I compare my image to Michael Fry's, during totality, I got orange on a couple of the moons, but the adjacent moons, they didn't end up being orange. And so why was that? I didn't quite understand what was going on and why I didn't. He had 8 or 9 moons, so 80 or 90 minutes worth of orange moons, and I had like only 25 minutes. So something was wrong with that. In addition, he got starry skies by taking sky pictures, and I took star pictures. I took star pictures, but I didn't, in this proof of concept image, blend in that star picture. So that's another issue that I need to fix here to realize my vision. And finally, I said I took, the easy way out, cropping off the missing corners in the bottom left and right-hand part of the sand. And so I was too aggressive in that. This picture would look better with more sand. And so there are ways to fix that. And so I set about coming up with a plan to fix all of these issues in my proof of concept picture here. So here's my plan. So I had cloud obscured moons, but those didn't occur during a time when the moon was actually eclipsed. So an easy solution is just to take one of the adjacent full moons and put it in the place of one of these obscured moons. So that's how I could fix that. For the oblong moons, I went and did a Google search and said, in Photoshop, how do you fix wide angle lens distortions? And it pointed out that there's this filter in Photoshop called the lens correction filter. and it should be able to do that. Okay, so I should be able to use the lens correction filter to fix that. I wanted to get the moons bigger. How could I do that? Well, I have gigapixel AI. I could use that. But there's also a feature built into Lightroom called the Enhance feature, which will double the size of your image in both the horizontal and vertical dimensions. So I could just use that feature in Lightroom to make my moons twice as big. And that would maybe give me a more impactful look of the moons. Okay. As a result of doing that, the moons are going to be moving. So I'm going to have to move the moons to the correct part in the place in the sky where they need to be. And to do that, well, that's pretty easy. I already have my proof of concept image. So I can use that as a layer in my image and just turn it off most of the time. But when I need to locate a moon, I can turn that on, take the moon, the new moon that I've gotten in a layer, and just using the move tool, drag it over and put it over, center it over the position, the appropriate corresponding moon in my proof of concept image. That was the original plan, but as I worked through this, as it turned out, there's a better way, and I'll show you later, and that's building a template, because in the template, you can make sure that all of the moons are going to be the same size. Whereas if you looked at my proof of concept image, you will see that, you know, those oblong moons are actually bigger than the moons towards the middle during eclipse. And so I've got moons that are of varying sizes, but I'll show you how to do that. Blending the moons in, you do that with a light and blend mode, but that can lead to some issues. When half of the moon is eclipsed and is shadowed and dark, it might be that it's darker than the sky that you're trying to blend it in with. As a result, you end up with sky showing through where there should be just plain shadowed moon. And sometimes that isn't so obvious, but other times you might happen to have a star behind there and you have a star shining through where there should be a moon. So I need to come up with ways to fix that. And there are two things you can do. In your foreground image and sky image, you can just simply put a mask where the moons should be to prevent any stars from shining through. And places where the shadow of the moon becomes just too dark and looks like a black hole, if need be, you can clone lighter parts of the shadow and fill that in. And I'll show a closer example of that later on. I said I needed to get the star image as my sky. And the way you do that is just like creating an HDR blend image. You've got in the normal foreground image for the beach, the sky is too bright. So I've taken a second image, which is a star image, which is a darker exposure to get the correct exposure for the sky. And you just put those two images together, create a mask of the sky so that you let the sky shine through where you want the sky to shine through. And then around the boundary, you just sort of blend it in. As it turns out, you can do this by hand, just with a brush in Photoshop, a soft brush. And I'll show you a little more about that later. Okay. Then finally, as I said, the corners of the beach got cut out when I did my geometric corrections, but you can fill in corners like that really easily with content-aware fill. And then I didn't have to crop off the bottom of the beach. So that's my plan. How did it actually work out in practice? So here are the various images that I used to build up the final image. Here is the image of the foreground, which I took before the eclipse started. It's lit with a full moon out here to the left, shining on the ground, providing plenty of light. I used the geometric correction to fix the building, so it's now upright. As a result, these little corners got lost. Okay, that's all right. As far as exposure for the beach, I just used the auto button in the basic panel for Lightroom, and it created an exposure that looked good to me. I tweaked the white balance a little. Due to the moon being out here to the left, this upper left part of the sky was really bright. So I added a graduated filter to darken down that part of the sky. And I only had to darken it down about a stop, and that improved the sky. And then as far as sharpening goes, I turned off sharpening because sharpening is something I plan to do later using Topaz AI Sharpen. Okay, the next image to blend in is my sky image. And so here's the sky image. And one thing I discovered afterwards is that in order to get this image to look good, I had to increase the exposure by more than 2 stops to just as a starting point. And what I hadn't taken into account when I planned out my star exposure was that I was using settings that were appropriate for if I was in a dark place like Joshua Tree, taking pictures of the stars. But here I was at a resort with a brightly lit, this is the Marriott Resort in Ko'olina, had brightly lit building, brightly lit sky as a result of that, and a moon to the left. And as a result, there was just too much light pollution to make that exposure correct. So it was just overexposed, but I was able to decrease it by 2 stops in Lightroom, add this graduated filter to the lower left-hand corner, moving on out towards the right to darken it again. And so that balanced out the exposure and gave me, stars and a sky that looked like a night sky. I didn't use any sharpening in this as well because I plan to use Topaz Denoise, which would clean up the noise in the sky and provide a little bit of sharpening as well. In addition to those things, there was some purple fringing that I needed to fix with a manual adjustment in Lightroom. And then finally, here are the sloping building. Since I'm going to blend this in with the foreground image, I needed to apply the same geometric corrections to this image so that this building would line up with the building below. Okay, and so this is how I went about doing the foreground image. It's a blending what I call the base image, a blending of that foreground image for the beach, and then the star image for the sky, and then whatever other adjustments I had to make. Let's take a look actually in Photoshop, and you can see things, I think, a little bit better. So to blend my 2 bottom images, I have the bottom layer is the foreground image. The next layer is the star image. And to blend them, what I did was I selected the foreground just using the quick selection tool. It did a so-so job, did a pretty good job on the buildings, did a bad job around palm trees here, did an okay job around the land to the right, and a so-so job to the palm tree on the right. But by refining it, going back and over, adding a little more in, subtracting a little more out, I was able to get a reasonably good selection. I then saved that as a foreground selection, inverted it, got a sky selection, and then when I added in a layer to the sky selection, I just used added in the layer with the sky image. I added a mask to that using the sky selection, and that left me with the sky shining through, although with some places that were not perfectly blended. There's not a good way to go back in Photoshop to show you what it looked like, but this is what happens with the mask. I had my original mask, which is in dark, and then with a low opacity paintbrush where bright parts of the sky from the foreground layer shone through and I didn't get the black sky from the night, I just started painting over with a low opacity, bringing in more of the dark sky. And if I got too much of that, I changed from a black brush to a white brush and painted that out again. And so just go back and forth, and you go over all of these areas where the blend isn't quite perfect, going back and forth between black and white, and you eventually get to a point where it looks like you've got a reasonable blend. And so if you look at this, carefully along the places where I've blended, it all sort of matches, and so it works out. So the blending, a manual HDR type blending, as it turns out, was not very difficult at all. Once I completed this blend, I made a essentially flattened or created a stamped layer, applied topaz denoise to that. Okay, as it turns out, I didn't like denoise everywhere, so I put it basically into the sky and removed it from some of the foreground, and that's what these masks are down here. I then noticed that there was something wrong in the image, and you can see it here. The lagoon here is reflecting the brighter sky from the foreground image, since that's where it comes from, rather than the darker sky of the star image. And so I needed to find a way to darken this lagoon. And what you can do is you can create a luminosity mask that basically picks out the lagoon. If you have Tony Kuiper's panel, which is this panel here, there are tools where you can click on the color and tone of the lagoon. It will select that. And that gives me a mask that I can then apply a curves layer and a hue and saturation layer to darken the lagoon. Now, it also selects other parts of the image. So you put that inside a group, and with the group, you put a mask and only mask that into the lagoon. But as a result, you end up with a darker lagoon that more matches the reflection. Okay, beyond that, I found that this palm tree over here to the right was a little bit bright. So I did a selection of the palm tree, and I did a levels adjustment on it, and I darkened that. I then did sharpening through Topaz Sharpen AI to the foreground. I did some other fixes to various things. This sun star was a little bit, well, this sun star was a little bit funky. I had to do a little bit of cleanup to that. But the net result was I got my base image all set. Oh, there are a few other cleanup things. Notice there's some lens flare here. Those get fixed with content-aware fill. There's a totally eclipsed moon over here that turns out to be a white blob when you expose for the stars. That gets fixed with content-aware fill. And so you go through all of that and end up with a base image that we can now start putting moons on top of. So let's get back to where we were. Okay, so now let's talk about the moon images. So for the moon images, what did I do to those? Well, I noticed there was chromatic aberrations that the default lens corrections in Lightroom didn't fix. So I used the manual chromatic aberration fiction tools to remove a red fringe on one side and a green fringe on the other of each moon. Okay, I didn't use any sharpening for the moons because I found out that when I increased the size of the moon, that sharpening really got accentuated and sort of looked like little dimples on a golf ball. And so I left sharpening would be until the end. Okay, to double the size of the moon, I used the new tool in Lightroom, which is called Enhance. And you use the photo menu and you pull down and select Enhance. It brings up a window that you see here on the right side of the slide, which shows you what your moon is going to look like when it's enhanced. You can click it on and off to see what a doubling in size with or without enhancing looks like. And then you just click the Enhance button. And what it does is then create a separate image that's a DNG image that is twice as big as your original image. And so that's the image that I was going to use for the moons. And to get it into the file with my base image, I just open that DNG file in Photoshop. So from Lightroom, right click and say, edit in Photoshop. And so it brings it up as a separate file in Photoshop. And in order to get it over into your original file, there are several ways. A lot of people use the move tool. I don't use the move tool because you have to hold down the shift key at a certain point, move the moon from one tab to another tab and bring it down and release the shift key at just the right point to get it all to work out right. Instead, what I do is I take that moon layer in its separate file, I right click and select duplicate layer. And when you do that, Photoshop brings up a dialog box that asks you, which file do you want to put the duplicate layer in? I then just chose my file that had the base image in it, and it put it there instead of on top of itself in its same file. And so I find that is the easy way to move a layer from one file to another file. Once I got it over there, I could then use Topaz Labs, Topaz Sharpen AI to sharpen the moon layer. What I did is I found that the motion blur setting looked the best. I chose the auto settings, but it was just a little too aggressive, so I cut those down a bit to give me a moon that looked reasonable. And I'll point out, I originally tried to do that as a plugin from Lightroom rather than Photoshop, but on my computer, Topaz Sharpen AI wouldn't open up when called from Lightroom. Works fine from Photoshop, but there's some glitch, something preventing it from doing it on my computer. On your computer, maybe it works fine, but for whatever reason, it doesn't on mine. Okay, so we got the moon. It's the larger size. It's sharpened now with Topaz Sharpen AI. And then I changed the layer blur mode to lighten, and that makes the moon show up. Of course, it's in the wrong position, and I'll need to move it. And we'll talk about moving the moons later. I will point out, however, that once you get to moons beyond the eclipse, in my case, that are to the right half of the image, since your moon layer is twice the size of your foreground layer, even after you turn on the light and blend mode, you won't see the moon because it's off the canvas to the right. As a result, you just need to have faith when you move it and keep moving it left, and it will eventually show up. Okay, so that's what I did for the majority of moons. For moons that were more eclipsed, there's a little more work involved. These are the moons where we can get for most of them, you can get a good orange color coming out. But I found that you needed to up the exposure a lot to extract the orange color. In fact, you had to up the exposure by about 2 stops to get it. And I went beyond that and put a radial filter over the moon and upped the exposure yet another stop that way. And that gave me, the nice orange color for the moon. But by doing that, the bright side of the moon, where it isn't eclipsed, is now just totally blown out white. If you want to have any bit of detail in that, the way you're going to do that is not by masking it out on the exposure that you've increased by 2 or 3 stops in Lightroom, but what you can do is take one of the other exposures. Since I took 3 bracketed exposures of each moon, I can take one of the darker exposures and adjust the exposure of that one for the bright part of the moon, and then blend the two together, essentially creating an HDR image of this eclipsed moon. And so that's what I did. I think in one particular case, I chose all 3 exposures to get a decent HDR blend, but usually it was just 2 exposures. One of the things you'll need to do, though, is these moon exposures are taken 20 or 40 seconds apart. And so they won't line up exactly. The moon is moving. So when you get them as layers in Photoshop, you have to align them by hand. So you take the top layer, lower its opacity to say 50%, and then use the move tool. And just with the arrow keys on your keyboard, you move the moon 1 pixel at a time until you line up the 2 different moons that you're blending together. Okay, and then you create the blend sort of like I did that blend of the star image with the foreground image. by using a soft, low opacity brush and just paint in whatever part of the bright part of the moon you want to cover over the overexposed part that was on the orange exposure of the moon. When blended, you can then flatten those together as one moon image and duplicate that into the other image and change the blend mode to lighten. I'll point out, though, that if you count the moons, there are 27 moons that I added into this. So I've got lots of different layers, and eventually you end up with a file that's too big to store as a PSD file or even a TIFF file. My image that I've ended up with now is more than 5 gigabytes in size. So at some point during this process, you need to resave it as a PSB file. And so I just point that out because it's something you need to do. Okay, so these moons that we're placing onto the picture, since I've doubled the size of them, I'm going to have to move them into location to get them to the proper place. I have my proof of concept image to show me where they need to be, but the moons in the proof of concept image are of varying sizes due to the wide angle lens distortion. So what I eventually figured out in this process was better than using that image as a layer for my place to position the moons. What was better was to create a template. And so what I did is I found one of my central moons, one of the eclipse moons, and used that as the template for the size of the moon that I wanted each of these moons to be. So I used the elliptical marquee tool and holding down the shift key, dragged it over the moon to create a circular selection and moved that so that it was positioned right over where that moon should be. And then I created a new layer, and in the new layer filled in the selection with a bright color. I chose this light green color. And that becomes now a template for where that particular moon will be. For the remaining moons, what you need to do is replicate that selection, move it over to the appropriate location for the next moon, fill it in on the template layer with the light green color, and then continue this process over and over again until you get the full arc of all the moons in place. Now they're in the right location, and they're also the right size, and they're all circular, so that when we correct the oblong shape of the moons, we'll be able to make sure that I've corrected them to a circular shape. Finally, now since I've got this template of the moons, since these moons are all high up in the image, and as it turns out, when I do a crop of the image to something more standard, I have pre-cut mats that I like to use for the pictures that I print out. And if I left these moons up as high as they came from the prototype image, the proof of concept image, when I cropped that down to fit in a sort of 3:2 aspect ratio mat, those moons would be right up against the top edge, and that's just too tight. And so I could take this template layer and just move the whole set of moons all down all at once to put them in a proper location. And so that's what I ended up doing to get moons that would create a better composition for my image. Okay, so how do you go about reshaping these oblong moons? Well, as I said, I looked up online and found out I could use this lens correction filter in Photoshop. And when you open up that filter, it brings up a dialog. It has an auto correction tab because it has a certain number of cameras and lenses that it has some basic knowledge about, but it didn't have any knowledge about my camera or my lens. So I went to the custom tab, and in the custom tab, there's the first slider is called remove distortion. So I found that by cranking that slider to the left for a moon on the most oblong moons, a value of about -25 worked out really well and made those moons almost perfectly circular. For moons that were closer to the center of the image, like the eclipsed moons, they were still a little bit oblong, and I found that values around -10 worked for those. So I went through the various different moons, and using this filter, corrected the distortion of the moons. Okay, it didn't necessarily make them perfectly circular, but we can fix that later with the free transform tool, and I'll show you that next. So once I got my now corrected, distortion corrected moon, and I moved it into place over my template, you take the template, you set the opacity to something low. For me, 15% worked, and it gives you this nice sort of little green target to put your moon over. I zoom in Photoshop to about 200% and try and line up the moon over that green target. As it turns out, in many cases, the moon is not perfectly circular, and you can see it in this case. So you use the free transform tool. You can now squish the moon down to fit into the space that you've allocated for in the template. And since the free transform will work on the entire layer, and I'm zoomed in at 200%, I really need to select a smaller part of the layer to work with, so I have handles to use the free transform tool on. So I put a rectangular selection just around my moon, something close to the moon, then invoke the free transform with Control-T, and then by pulling on these various different tabs, you can get this moon to shrink down this direction and shrink down this direction. The free transform tool, I'm not quite sure. I haven't gone and read the instructions on how exactly you get it to do things, but it seems if you just pull on one of these corners, it's going to move things kind of uniformly. So I found out by holding down the Shift key, I could get it to warp the moon a little more closely from just one side and not affect the other side. But your mileage may vary because, like I said, I didn't read the directions. Okay, so that got me my moons positioned where they needed to be. Now I just needed to do some cleanup of some of the moons. As I said, partially eclipsed moons might have its shadowed part darker than the sky behind it. As a result, the sky behind it shows through the moon. And in this case, you can actually see there's a star shining through. So there are a couple of things that you do to fix this. One is you go to that my base image and put a mask on the base image, and where the moons are located, you just paint in black at that location so that there are no longer any stars that could possibly shine through. So that gets rid of any stars behind the moon. And since the moon's covering over the locations, it doesn't matter that you don't have any sky behind there. The second thing you can do is, if this shadowed part is really dark, you can clip a curves layer to your moon and then raise the black point a notch or two to get your moon, the shadow, not quite so dark. And that might let it shine through a little bit better and not look like just some big black hole. In some instances, it looked just a little bit too dark compared to the sky behind it. And in those cases where bringing up the black point was not sufficient, I just did a little cloning. I took some of the lighter shadow of the moon and cloned it over the darker part and tried to give a nice even blend down to the edge and make the moon look natural that way. So that's how I fixed that part of the moon. After that, there was only some general cleanup that I needed to do. There was a bright sign down on the land that there was no reason to leave in, so I did a content-aware fill to remove that out. Individual moons, I found some of them were a little brighter than others or darker than others, so I used a brightness contrast layer clipped to each individual moon layer to tweak with the adjustment of the moons. And I didn't do any cropping in Lightroom, but I did bring up the crop tool to helped me in designing where I moved that template down to know that once I did finally make a crop later, I would have the moons lowered to appropriate place. It's just my particular way of working. I choose to do all my cropping in Lightroom because I can make virtual copies and choose different crops depending on different mats that I might have or different size pictures that I might want to make. So that's just my way of working. And as a result, here we go. Here's the final image.
Wow.
The new image compared to the proof of concept.
Oh
and
my gosh, Jeff is
awesome.
beautiful. Oh my gosh.
So it was a lot of work.
Yeah.
I spent, I don't know how many hours, but probably 30, 40, 50 hours
At least.
working on that. A lot of it was figuring out things that I was doing wrong and needed to fix, to correct. Like, you know, halfway through the process, I came up with the notion of creating this template layer to place the moons on. Partway through the process, I had noticed that I had originally sharpened the moons, and when I enlarged them, I got these dimples in the moons. And so, you know, work had to be redone, but it ended up, I'm now getting quite happy with what I've ended up with.
The fourth one,
go ahead.
The fourth one from the left's a little low to me.
I can always go back and fix that. I've got all the layers, but to me, looks close enough.
That is amazing, Jeff. Truly amazing.
Jeff, did you do your post-processing once you got home, or did you do it over there?
Oh, absolutely. The only thing I did in Hawaii was do this proof of concept image that you see on the left. And I actually showed that in one of our sip and share meetings after I had done that.
Yeah.
But I knew that told me that there was promise here, but I still had a lot of work left to do.
I was just wondering if you ever left your room.
Oh, no, I did not do the processing. I started this processing a little over a month ago before our last sip and share, or that we did from vision to master file. And I was thinking of volunteering to Dawn that I would do it at that point.
Wow.
But I wasn't ready yet. And I've done an awful lot of work since then to get it to what I want. However, if I had to do this over again, there are some things that I would improve. And here they are. During, you know, the taking of the pictures, you've got to adjust the exposure all during the night. And that means you got to touch your camera and adjust it. And here I've got a camera on a travel tripod put in sand, and that made me really nervous. And so what I was thinking I might do is the camera has a Wi-Fi capability, and with Wi-Fi, you can connect your phone to the camera so that you can control the camera with the phone. And I was thinking that would probably be a good way to do it because I wouldn't then have to touch the camera at all. However, that would, if you turn the Wi-Fi on, it's going to really run down the battery. And so I'd end up changing batteries during the night, and changing the batteries, I'd probably bump the camera worse than just changing the exposure. So I didn't want to do that. But what I've discovered is there are these things called dummy batteries. I don't know what the official term for it is, but it's a battery that plugs into your camera, has a wire coming out, and then you can plug that into the wall and power your camera while you're running it. It's meant for working in studio settings and whatever. My camera is a Canon camera, and that's what they make. Canon makes for the camera. But there are third-party companies that make them, and now they have versions where instead of plugging into the wall, it has a USB connection. And so you can connect it instead of to the wall to a power bank. And so now I could take a power bank out with me, plug this dummy battery into the camera, and I'd have enough power to be able to turn on the Wi-Fi and then control the camera from my phone. And if the phone battery was getting low, the power bank has a separate USB connection that I can power the phone from as well. So I'd certainly do that so that I wouldn't have to touch the camera anymore. The second thing I would do, since I had to up the exposure so much to get that orange color to come out of my eclipsed images, I think I might, instead of doing one stop bracketing like I did, I think I might up that to 1 1/3 or 1 2/3 stops of bracketing, and maybe even bias the bracketing towards the overexposed side so that, you know, it would be easier to just get that orange color coming out. That would, of course, mean that you're going to have somewhat longer exposures, which might mean then higher ISOs during the eclipse part. But, you know, we've got topaz denoise and AI, so that's not a big issue. Another thing I would do, I sort of used this suggestion Michael Fry had of using F11 and focusing at the hyperfocal distance so that I'd get my foreground image in sharp and the moon should be acceptably sharp. But if I look closely at my moons, I think they're not as sharp as they really should be. Maybe I focused not really hyperfocal, maybe a little bit, you know, too short of a focal distance. So I think in the future, what I would do is I would use F11 to take a picture of the foreground, get a nice foreground image. But then for the moons, there's no reason to keep the f-stop setting at F11. I could change that to F8 or F5.6, and I could even refocus on the moons and therefore get a sharper moon. And with a bigger aperture, I wouldn't have to get the ISO up as high when I got those longer exposures. So I definitely do that. And then the final thing is it would be great to find a darker place to take the shot so I could get more stars in my image. But those are the things in retrospect that, you know, I think would help. But it was a fun experience, and it's actually fun enough that I think I would do it over again.
Wow.